Hello, good morning, good evening, welcome. This is the finale. This is the last in the current series of tech sessions brought to you by Empire Engineering. I'm Stu Pringle, I'm your chair for today's session, and I'm joined by some very special guests who I'll introduce in just a moment. For the regulars, you'll see that today's a little bit different. Rather than slides and a presentation, this one is a panel debate, and today's discussion is all about the future of offshore wind. First, a little bit about your hosts. Empire Engineering is an engineering consultancy that supports the offshore wind industry with advice, insight, and technical know-how. Headquarters are in Bristol, and there are offices in both London and also Aalborg in Denmark, and the team can be deployed all around the world. A little bit of housekeeping. Many of you are regulars and know the score. If it's your first time, you'll see on the right-hand side that there is a chat function. Please say hello. It's always nice to hear from you. We'll be sharing our screens. You don't need to do anything. You can just sit back and enjoy the ride. If you would like to submit a question to the panel, you'll see at the bottom, ask a question. Please take part and say what you want to say in there. I'm now going to introduce today's speakers. So today I am joined by Sally Shenton, who is the director at Generating Better, which is an offshore wind O&M consultancy. Hello, Sally.
Hi, Stu. Hi, everyone.
Hello. I'm also joined by Lars Nicolaisen, who is head of foundations at Vattenfall Offshore Wind. Good morning, Lars.
Good morning. Hi, everyone.
I'm also joined by Tobias Lind, who's engineering manager at Copenhagen Offshore Partners. Hello, Morten.
Yeah, hello. Hi to all.
Morten's joining us from Seoul, so we are interrupting his Friday evening, so I'm extra grateful you're coming along. And hopefully we should also have Alan Crockett, who's foundation package manager at Dogger Bank Wind Farm. Alan was on the line earlier, but I think he's just had a little bit of internet issues, so I will try and bring him on stage in the next few seconds. Finally, last but not least, we have Karl Davis, who is the founder and managing director of Empire Engineering. Hello, Karl.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Right then, without further ado, let's get into it. I'll kick off with a question to the panel. Okay, I think we would all agree that offshore wind is on the up, but looking ahead, is the level of planned growth realistic? Where are the bottlenecks going to appear? And Lars, let's kick things off. Go on then.
Yes,
What do you think?
Thank you, Stuart. Well, first of all, I have to say that it is a little bit difficult to stay pessimistic with this outlook we see ahead of us. But of course, there are obstacles and potential bottlenecks which will most likely vary between the different markets that we are operating in. And I'll just mention a few that we maybe can discuss further. I think one of the issues is that using electricity as the main means of transportation of energy is something that we may have to look at, because obviously not all energy demand can be met with electricity. So the whole topic of energy mix and power to X storage, all that discussion is a potential bottleneck, or at least an obstacle that we need to deal with in order to be able to use the full potential of offshore wind. And that is also linked to, of course, electrical infrastructure that we all know, of course, that we don't currently have a grid system that can actually that can meet the full supply of electricity produced by offshore wind. That also needs to be dealt with. That's a little bit linked also to the permitting issue, meaning that there need to be political will, and it has to be prioritized that we have this long-term planning. So coming from Vattenfall, of course, with the recent developments in the UK, these stop and go situations that we all faced with, that permits are withdrawn, and we don't know until very late in the process whether or not a project can kick off. That is, of course, something that will at least delay development, and which also have an impact on the supply chain, because it means that we are not able to make binding contracts with suppliers in due time for them, maybe to develop the for instance, installation vessels that they need to accommodate for larger turbines. And so it's all this chicken and egg discussion, I think, is a potential bottleneck. And then finally, a more general issue, I think, also with this growing market we see ahead of us, I think there will be a bottleneck simply related to the skills and competences available. So there's simply not enough experienced and qualified people in offshore wind to meet the demand for people working with offshore wind in the future. So this is, of course, a bit of many different issues, but I think they're all relevant with different maybe meaning or different importance in the different markets. But I think generally there are things we need to deal with in order to meet these very ambitious targets that the politicians have set out for us.
Yeah, Lars, that's some really interesting points. I mean, political certainty.
We have an Alan.
Oh,
sorry.
welcome, Alan.
Welcome.
Sorry about that.
Let's introduce Alan Crockett.
Alan is Foundation Package Manager at Dogger Bank Wind Farm. Alan, thank you for joining.
Apologies for that. Morning, all.
Not a problem at all. Okay, so Lars was just talking about pyramids. Karl.
So Lars raised a number of interesting points in terms of the bottlenecks we see going forward for offshore wind. So political certainty, I think, it was a key one, and that's always a challenge with large infrastructure projects. Our project timescales are longer than political cycles, and that always creates a slight challenge. Is my audio okay? I'm getting
It's a little bit crackly there. Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Let's try that. Apologies. So political certainty over those sort of timeframes of our projects is a real challenge, but that's the same with all infrastructure projects. And then, I mean, just supply chain, where do we get all the kit we need? Turbines, foundations, vessels, that's going to be a big issue, I expect. I think we can all see that. I'm going to hand over to Morten while I sort out some audio.
Yeah, I think also we need to consider, of course, there's a lot of stakeholders here, and maybe the market is a bit more elastic than we think around the world. I think we often see it as some stakeholders or the employers driving the market, but there are also other interests. I mean, many political. There's also some national some interests we have to foresee here. I mean, you're talking about the supply chain. Yes, of course, the supply chain is super valuable wherever you go in the world, meaning that if you are to exploit wind in whatever region you come to, they are also expecting that the supply chain will sit on that region. You become self-dependent. There's a lot of interest in making sure that the supply chain follow the wind farm, and that means that's a huge lag time. Both politically and for other employers entering markets. And I actually see that the wind farms, as the sizes are growing, that will delay some of the larger infrastructure programs, at least outside Europe. I know Europe is far advanced, and now, of course, from Denmark and Northern Europe that has developed this early on. I think it's a bit more firm there. But outside in Northern Europe, it's very different. There's many other interests, and they come with the size of wind farm, who benefits from it, local content, etc. And that has to be met, these demands, and that will actually perhaps slow down some of the larger infrastructure projects around the world. And but that's only a part of it. I think we also need to understand that the electrical market is different from the other energy markets that has a sort of another where the market is governing. Here we have to look at the cost of electricity because it's the consumers actually we need to meet. I mean, the empty chair in the room. We also have to address that because at the end of the day, is actually trying to bring down costs of electricity and not to have an open market, because it's not an open market with wind farms. It's a closed market. Unless, of course, the infrastructure is even further developed into the nearby countries, etc., where we have the energy islands, etc. But we have to consider that too. It's the market is a bit more closed. Cost of electricity has to be met, and otherwise it's slowing down the progress.
I think in the O&M phase as well, there are additional barriers. So I completely echo the issue about skills. So, making sure that we have the skilled workforce and that we're seeing that as its own pipeline. I think we always just see now jobs advertised requiring 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years experience, and we can't continue with that. We need to grow our skill base for operations, but also ports and harbours for O&M. So particularly in new markets where the infrastructure may lack investment over many decades, making sure that we have the right service bases available to efficiently operate from, I think is another thing. But I would also throw out there, we've talked about, is the planned growth realistic? Are we ready in case it goes bananas as well? Because, as countries realise their, increased climate change ambitions, there's going to be global competition between markets for these scarce resources, whether it's manufacturing capacity, whether it's vessels for installation, or whether it's just people. So I think, we've surprised ourselves in the past with how successful we've been in offshore wind, and I think we should have half an eye on being ready for even greater things as well.
Sally, I think it's a really good point in terms of that lack of how do we respond to such a rapidly growing market. Just in terms of people, I mean, so obviously Morten has recently gone to Seoul to help deliver projects out there. But if you look at demand for people with an offshore wind at the moment, it's really, really challenging to staff projects well. We're all seeing that. And the expectation is that these people will just come from somewhere as we keep growing, and it's a bit unrealistic. At the moment, what we see is people are just fighting between each other to get the best people, and it's just going to get worse and worse.
I can't help thinking that some of the challenges could be overcome if there were political will to prioritize the more long-term planning. I think some of it, and I think we will get back to it maybe a little later, but some of the part of the agenda is partly politically driven. So we don't have it's not prioritized, for instance, to invest in improving the grid system in Europe, because because there's no political real interest in that. So it's more other projects which are more politically interesting that will be prioritized, and that not necessarily to the advantage of the development of offshore wind. And also the permitting issue, it should be possible, I think, to not that I suggest that we should shortcut democracy, of course, but to somehow make some more long-term planning that would enable both developers and supply chain to prepare in due time to overcome some of these bottlenecks.
But I think also that part of that say supply chain, because the supply chain is super valuable, that has to be driving that outside the normal supply chain, where countries build their own supply chain or separate companies in other places in the world than normal big OEMs. It's just difficult. It's a difficult market to enter at this point in time, because it's and we can see that with small companies trying to, even large companies trying to build their own turbines. That's just a difficult task. It's a difficult market to get into, meaning that itself is a barrier for entry. So
Morten, picking up on that, I mean, we're seeing a lot of new global markets, but some of them, can be quite small, perhaps in the eyes of the OEMs, both from a developer and perhaps a service agreement side of things. So, are they going to be interested in these sorts of things?
If you're asking me, and now I sit in Korea, which is an upcoming market, yeah, I think the outlook is it's superb, because it's like it's a blank sheet for wind farms at the moment. But of course, and a huge potential. This is 50 million people sitting on a peninsula without any wind farms at all, and a huge demand for energy. But we're coming back to the permit part, yes. But where do you start when you have to look to other countries how to start a permit regulation for this? That takes time, and that's a political sphere that is taking years to build. But of course, that's also why it starts in smaller projects, builds up, but it'll come. But the OEMs now are looking for the bigger markets. That's obvious. But in some time, of course, it will come. But I don't see that they all see an interest. Obviously, I mean, if you can sell your product, yes, there is an interest. But
yeah, I would draw parallels between onshore wind 10 years ago, actually, where we saw huge demand in for onshore turbines, and the limitation to building wind farms was getting hold of a turbine, and that was the real, crux. And I can see that happening again, and the ability to produce turbines fast enough for a growing international market has to be questioned. And if you're one of the big guys, you're going to want to supply to gigawatt farms rather than new developing 100 megawatt in new markets. So I think those new developing markets will be at risk of being kind of marginalized and growing slower just because they can't get access to the supply chain.
But I don't know if I have to swap slightly, but we were also talking about floating at some point, and the thing is with floating is it's much more versatile. It actually offers opportunities where the fixed bottom is sort of fixed, and that maybe there's a business opening there where you can actually there is a slight disruptor, because the thing is this: what sort of vessels do you need to install a floater? Can you actually fit the turbine on a harbor and do a sail out, or how do you do all this? It might be that the industry is changing somewhat, and the floating industry might disrupting this, because it doesn't have to be a customized product on a specific site where a fixed bottom is, but you can sail around with it. You can sell it off after you have used it, and then that means that you downgrade it into other countries that are might looking for a second-hand wind farm. You never know. I'm only saying there's also opportunities that we might not see yet.
It's a really interesting point, Morten, and it feeds into this idea of, are we growing because of political will, or is it an actual demand from the market? And when you look at floating versus fixed and that growth, and this is something that I think that, Sally, you've got some views on, where is this demand coming from and why are we seeing this growth? Is it really about, cost of energy? And
I think the political will and the sort of driver for cost of energy reduction go hand in hand in a way. Because I've been involved in offshore wind since the very early days when it was considered career suicide to move into wind. And we'd all get lectured on don't leave coal and gas because this wind thing is never going to take off. And, the people that were involved then went on a massive mission to reduce the cost of energy, surprised themselves, and now that's why we're seeing, these very competitive projects can beat new coal, can beat new nuclear, can beat new gas. So we've kind of earned the right to grow. And I think that shows that it's both driving down the cost of energy allows us to then have a seat with the politicians and say, look, this is really viable, we've de-risked, we're cheaper, we're fast to install, got a pipeline that's very viable. And then in turn, that unlocks some of the political challenges that we're seeing. And I admit that we're not there yet. And there are still a lot of barriers that need support from governments. We're in a much better place than we were 10 or 15 years ago, when it was difficult to even have those conversations. So, I think by earning the right to grow, we've earned a seat at the table with the big boys. and that will only help us to unlock some barriers and grow further.
I think that's right, but I also think that in order to progress floating wind, I still think we need government support and political will, because there are still, although I'm actually quite optimistic generally about floating wind, I think that it will be competitive maybe within the next 10 years, but it will require still government support, because it's difficult to see that floating wind will be able to compete in auctions with the bottom fixed, at least the bottom fixed are available. Of course, in some emerging markets where bottom fixed are not really an option, then it's a different issue. But otherwise, I think continued support, and also continued support to innovative solution installation is one issue, but there are of course a number of still unsolved challenges related to floating wind, which will be overcome at some point, but it will require attention.
Yeah, and that ramp for floating wind to become commercially viable is a lot steeper than the ramp that we saw with fixed bottom, isn't it? So we're looking, certainly in the UK, we're looking at floating going into the next CFD auction, and in a big way the one after that. So we're looking at a matter of years rather than 5 years that we had before to reduce our costs. I think as well the facilities that are needed for floating wind, the challenges are different. So you pointed to the fact we don't need these big installation vessels anymore. What we do need is like loads of space and really good harbours. So we need lots of quayside, we need deep water, not just for construction, but also for our maintenance activities. And I was talking to someone the other day about just the cranes that we need to have on the quayside there, and there are only a few cranes in the world big enough at the moment to do these gigantic lifts that we need to do and to maintain the turbines afterwards. So we're kind of shifting the challenges into sort of different zones, aren't we? And we need to get on top of that fast.
So Sally, you see those offshore, the big floating wind farms being maintained in harbour rather than the maintenance all being done offshore?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I first heard the tow to shore concept, I was very sceptical about whether that would be the right approach. But I've been working with others quite recently to do some cost modelling and to look at the risks and challenges of doing that kind of main component maintenance on site. And I do believe that floating tow to shore, as long as the facilities are there, close enough, will be the most cost-effective way to go. Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, I've done a 180 actually, Karl, on it. I've done myself a complete 180, and I'm really thinking it's the right approach.
That's a complete diversion, but Lars, Morten, I'd like your thoughts on that. Tow to shore for maintaining your floaters.
Yeah, why not? I'm only saying, I mean, 10, 20 years ago, there were studies in oil and gas. How do you tow out a small unmanned jacket? I mean, it's not that far away. Of course, it's a bigger challenge towing around with a 15 megawatt turbine and stuff like that. But I'm only saying, when this kicked off 25 years ago, and you had a small turbine sitting near shore, you wouldn't think you would turn up with a 15 megawatt, would you? That's 15, 20 years ago. Actually, 15. I'm only saying that the leaps are a bit bigger now, and also there's also a much bigger market, and there's a demand for floating that you cannot overcome. As Lars says, there are just places in the world where you cannot fit a fixed bottom turbine.
And you have to look at the alternatives, don't you? It's really looking at the alternative to tow to shore main component exchange is some enormous floating crane vessel, which may not be available for that 3 days a year that you need it to do the maintenance on your site, and the waiting times that you then might have for that vessel to become free, coupled with the cost of it, completely, destroys the business case.
But
maybe that's outside as well, yeah.
Sorry.
Mark's been waiting in.
Okay, but there's also a topic on we were talking about bottlenecks also, but about storage. The thing is, how big can wind grow actually? Because as we know, the wind is not blowing all the time, and if it suddenly has a demand line that says we need energy now, then we also need storage. I mean, it comes with the equation as wind grows. The demand for storage is also there, and obviously it has to come from the employers that generate energy, because they're competing with other competitors in this mix here. So that's actually how fast can they actually develop their storage facilities?
Or maybe alternatively, to challenge the concept that electricity is necessarily the medium for transportation of energy from offshore wind. So we could, of course, there's a lot of research ongoing with regards to various different biofuels.
Yes.
That maybe also change things completely. Also, maybe be even more cost effective because these very expensive large diameter export cables can be then maybe replaced by a simple tube that will transport hydrogen or something else. To go. And I think floating wind could have a potential advantage, because as I understand it, they're not so sensitive to, it would be more easy to fit a hydrogen electrolysis system on a floating wind system than on a bottom fixed. And also the turbine size, the foundations are not as sensitive to increased turbine sizes as we see for instance, traditional monopiles. So that mix could maybe also show a way for floating wind to be more successful than we imagine.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
We've had a few questions in. Karl, is any of those you'd like to have a field at?
I've been trying to keep up with them. They keep coming through thick and fast. So Dirk Bullis has put an interesting one. It's, do you see opportunities for new OEMs focusing on floating offshore wind only? I've got some thoughts on that, but I think I'll throw that out to the crowd. Morten, Lars, Sally, any thoughts on OEMs, new OEMs just focusing on floating?
I don't see there's a need for it, but if there is a space for it, let the market decide if they see this as a growing opportunity. Yeah, why not? Of course, it's we have to admit it's a different technology altogether. It's much more dynamic, so it could be new industries, but new OEMs are not necessarily think that. I think there's new, but I don't see there's a need for that. But we can also see that, of course, there are other players now that were not there 10 years ago. I mean, we know about the oil and gas industry. I mean, you have to place your bets on what's looking sustainable, and offshore wind, or wind for that matter, is looking sustainable, whereas oil is not. So of course, those OEMs will pop up and compete with the existing OEMs for wind. Obviously, they will, and they also come with a different technology altogether, because they've been used to floating vessels.
It's interesting. We haven't really had a radical change in technology throughout our journey in offshore wind, have we? The turbines we have today, whilst they're obviously very much bigger, are pretty much based on the concept of a sub 1 megawatt onshore wind turbine, aren't they? You know, and you think about the potential for innovation over the longer term, you know, because we're not going to solve our climate change problems in the next 5 to 10 years. This is a long journey that we're on. Then, you know, things like looking at more modular approaches where you don't even need to do main component exchanges in O&M. That would be on my wish list, you know, all at power. We looked at more concept. You know, there are all sorts of different ways to use wind to create energy. So it would be quite fascinating if we got new players coming in on the back of floating that might shake things up a bit.
Yeah, and if we're really keen on wind, then we also need to develop technologies that are easily scalable and transportable to other regions of the world where energy is also in a big demand, and they have to close that gap that we have had to spend 20 years on. So I mean, but it's obvious that both Africa now, of course, obviously South America is picking up also, but other places in the world where energy is also in demand, but the technology and the supply chain is not necessarily in place.
I think that as well there are potential, Karl, there are models for doing the operational phase differently. So as turbines age, rather than decommissioning them, I think there'll be a market for different service providers to come in that maybe have a low cost option, once CapEx is paid down, looking at life extension and just trying to get as much out of those assets as possible. So I think there are potential disruptive service models as well.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I mean, how big can a turbine get? I mean, would it be better to focus on getting the same size turbines done cheaper? I mean, would that be a better disruptor for cost of energy?
I think there's a big fundamental question there. If we're looking ahead, how big can things get, Morten, as you said? So let's put that out. How big do you think we're going to go in the next 10 years in terms of turbine size? What do you think a sensible limit is, and where do you think the limit lies? What's going to drive that? What's stopping us doing 30 megawatts?
Well, we've got 164 people listening in, so down the right-hand side, let's see what thoughts are.
I think at least from the traditional foundation, taking the foundation's perspective a little bit, I think that would be most likely, I would expect, not feasible, because the foundation size will become so large, and the knock-on effects on manufacturing and installation will be difficult and expensive to handle. So I think it will turn out that it will be more feasible really with either smaller turbines, or maybe then again floating could maybe carry a 30 megawatt turbine more easily than traditional bottom fixed foundations.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective that the floaters might actually be much more competitive when you go truly big, and we might be coming towards some sort of limit in fixed bottom at the moment at the 15 to 20 megawatt size, but that next jump might be floating, and that might be where floating actually starts to compete, because cost-wise, floating really still struggles in my view.
It does. But I think probably, I don't know, but I would expect that it would be possible to manufacture and install a monopile that can carry a 30 megawatt turbine. But I think it would be so cumbersome and expensive, and that it would not simply be feasible. I don't suggest maybe that the technical limit is the foundation, but I think more the economical or financial limit would be there.
Yeah, that limit jumping from monopile to jacket, we have to be hitting that at some sites now. 15 megawatt turbines, the weights of those, the load you're seeing, even the 14 meter diameter monopiles in deep water, you're going to struggle. So yeah, that transition to jacket, it's been prolonged for a long time, but
yeah. But could also be jumping directly from monopiles to floating. I think that's also been discussed, whether we need this.
Do we need jackets? Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's even been discussions about floaters in water that isn't super deep, but where maybe you've got more challenging seabed conditions, and that might open up new areas of seabed too.
Yeah, or where you've got big currents like the Atlantic Array that didn't go ahead because it was a difficult site to work on. Yeah, you could have, in 40 meters of water or so. Yeah, floaters.
But I also think actually maybe it's not the size of the turbine, because there's always a natural limit, because it's either governed by, first of all, technology, but also the vessels and also the risk the OEMs will have to take to actually, how do we install this, and are there vessels enough, and can we do it timely, etc. And all sort of other risks should it fail. But I think actually that so it's not so much the biggest turbine will win necessarily, because it's also about it's about cost of energy really, and also about part of it is also about profit for the OEMs. So how do you find that balance somewhere where you first of all have a steady supply, low downtime, but also a reasonable profit and can deliver energy efficiently and cheap. Because the thing is if it has to, wind is not that big today. I mean, renewables is supplying 10%, but that includes everything else apart from offshore wind also. So if it has to really compete, be a big player, then it also really has to look at the profits, because that will attract lenders and other finances, but also outcompete some of the traditional energy sources much more efficiently. And that's really what's needed. I mean, it's actually not trying to build it bigger and bigger and bigger, but actually show that you can actually produce cost efficiently and cheap. If you can do that, actually, then the market will just explode. Really, not necessarily the size of turbines. I think.
And I think, panel, where we've been discussing a lot about the bottlenecks is that's where, if we're talking about the next 10 years, that's where things are potentially very exciting, because offshore wind could play a really big part in the overall picture.
And I don't know if we should mention, I mean, the fourth round here in UK, I mean, how that is developing cost-wise. I'm only saying that is really, that is an eye-opener, right? Because suddenly you see actually that, there's a lot of money in energy, and it attracts a lot of different players, and also players that are new, but also, of course, obviously is attracted to this market. But are they also playing, as I say, to the empty chair in the room, the customer? The first of all, the taxpayer who's putting aside their tax to develop this, but also actually had to consume the energy. I think that's that's a discussion that's a much more delicate than about technology, really, because it is about producing energy at low cost. That's the only way the market will expand.
It relates to an interesting question raised by Harry Gallery here. So what does the panel believe the impact of majors such as BP and Shell coming into offshore wind will be? Lars, you got any views on the impact of these guys coming in?
Well, I think we should generally welcome competition, but of course, what Morten touched on is, of course, could potentially be challenging. I think what will happen is that development will accelerate further. So I think it is for the benefit of the entire industry, actually, that I think that these oil majors come in. But of course, the recent UK round 4, of course, also indicates that maybe governments around the world should maybe reconsider the way they offer contracts to developers. But I think that is, in my opinion, a detail that will be overcome. So my general reply is that it will increase competition, and there's, as we have discussed, the market is enormous. So I think there's room for more players in the market. So I think we should welcome them, and they also bring in maybe experience from the oil majors. Obviously, bring in experience that could potentially be used to further accelerate development of floating wind, as we have discussed. So I think it's a positive development.
Yeah, I would echo that, except I'm going to be, I don't work for a big corporate, so I can just
go on, Sally.
Can't I? So there's a danger, isn't that these new entrants are so desperate to get a foot in the door that they'll pay a lot more money than everyone else will do, and that's what we're sitting around for. And although that might be good in the short term for treasury coffers and even for the Queen, it will put the price, if they can't develop those sites in the northwest in 5 years, and everyone I know is saying that is a massive ask to get consenting and route to market and all their studies done in 5 years to get to FID, then the price of energy will definitely go up. And I've seen people quoting on LinkedIn £20 a megawatt hour on top, which is quite frustrating for those of us that have spent the last 15 years getting the price down.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it would be, it'd be really interesting to get in the room with Ofgem and the Crown Estate and Bays and have that discussion, wouldn't it, about how do you actually make sure that this whole market works for everybody? So
that's also what I mean by saying that there will be some initial adjustment in the way the projects are checked out. I think that is needed, but I think the government will realize what Morten also touched on, that the cost of electricity or energy has to be the main driver. So they will realize that also, I'm sure.
Yeah, there isn't really enough conversation about that cost of energy. Like you say, the empty chair in the room isn't having enough influence on the debate of what the cost of energy is going to be. It's all very political at this stage. It's all a bit popular, and there's going to be some sharp realizations when we see what the cost of energy is going to have to be. And that renewable energy, as much as we like to think it's competitive, in some cases it's got to be more expensive. And no one really seems to be kind of addressing that at this point.
Very good. That feels maybe a nice moment to perhaps to bring things towards a close for today's session. I'm just watching our time and we're a little bit over. Has anyone got any other views or any other thoughts that they'd like to share on the topic of the future of offshore wind?
No, nobody mentioned the energy islands. Anyways, let's see. Let's see where that's
I
going.
knew he was going to say that.
But I think actually maybe that will create a different mix with wind and other energy sources that we haven't seen before. Let's hope that. I mean, because it's a good idea. Of course, it haven't materialized yet in that sense. But at least we need also to work on the bit more funky ideas sometimes in order to move this industry here. And that's actually maybe a good way of mixing the energy a bit more and develop it even further.
Okay.
Very good.
I think the future is very bright, isn't it, Stu? Because we've got an opportunity to, through the hydrogen stuff, to really spearhead more green steel production. Through our vessel use, to think about decarbonising vessels, and I think the industry's in a really good place to sort of lead on these wider challenges as well. So yeah, let's get a bit more funky, definitely.
Get more funky.
On that note, that definitely feels like a nice time to bring it to a close. So I would like to say thank you all for taking part today. I'd also like to say thank you to our series sponsors, ITH Boating and Wood Thilstead, who've backed this whole Foundation X Tech Sessions series. And as I mentioned, this is the last in the current series. So I'd encourage you all to please share your feedback. I've just popped a link up in the chat there. That will let us know what you thought of what we're doing, and will help inform future events, be it virtual or maybe even in real life again one day. So it just leaves me finally to say thank you very, very much to our speakers, and thank you very much indeed to all of you who have attended in big numbers this month. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you along, and I hope you enjoyed it. Keep an eye out on the Empire and Engineering site, because I'm quite sure the Foundation X Tech Sessions will be back in some shape or form coming soon. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.